So expectation from today's session, we will take on from where we left on session 0. We'll talk about health data interoperability a little bit, its importance. We'll talk about FHIR, its core principles and its background and its community. Then we'll talk about the key concepts that any person should know about FHIR. Okay. If time permits, we'll go and see some real world use cases of FHIR. And then we want to devote a larger piece of time in Q&As and discussion. Okay. If you think of the distribution, I think last 30 minutes should be for question, answers, and discussions, because that's where the live session adds more value and where you can have your doubts cleared. Okay. So with that, we move on to the next. So before we move to the actual session, we wanted to talk to you about the FHIR India community, because this initiative is being run by FHIR India community. And FHIR India community is an open community of HL7 FHIR and interoperability enthusiasts. We are present on LinkedIn. Our social media LinkedIn group is there. We will request 1 minute for you to please join the LinkedIn group if you have not joined. That will help us keep in touch. And we do share some important stuff or some useful stuff on LinkedIn as well. So it will be good. So I'll take 1 minute pause or 30-second pause. If you're not on LinkedIn, if you're not on LinkedIn group, please join the group. Either you can use the group URL or you can just scan the QR code and you can join. All right. So again, this initiative, the FHIR Basics Learning Initiative, is brought to you by HL7 FHIR India community, and we are being supported by HL7 India. This is a community effort. What it means is it's all volunteer, and people have come together for this session, and there are more and more volunteers who are joining as we speak. If you are also interested in joining and helping us out, please reach out. Okay. This training or this course is no way a replacement to official training that is being provided by HL7. Okay, so this is only for community learning and only for getting started. If you want any formal training, please use formal trainings that are provided by HL7 organization. The intent of this learning is to get you started and get you to participate in the community so that you can participate, learn, build alongside others. Course layout and delivery. There was a question that was asked last week on what's the delivery and what's the agenda for the course. So the course is spread around 4 weekends, 4 Saturdays and Sundays, around 10 to 12 hours. 3 hours per weekend is what we are targeting. There will be theory and practical sessions, and there will be industry expert-led bonus sessions that will be during the weeks. So, for example, we would have a FHIR terminology or a healthcare terminology session midweek this week. We will also have a session on ABDM, Ayushman Bharat Digital Mission, this week or next week, where the experts will talk about those specific topics in detail. They will be augmenting your FHIR basics learning, but they will not be part of your 10 to 12 hours learning. Okay. And agenda for the next session, what will be on the next weekend? We will be circulating that at the end of this session or at the end of this week. Okay. So now coming to the training. So we'll start with the need for data exchange and standards. And since most of you or all of you are working in healthcare, and you are the users or consumers of the internet and social media, you are aware that data exchange plays a crucial role in enabling any of the interaction or enabling any of the today's world's. So if you have to do anything, data exchange is important. And data exchange on standards is what enables interoperability, and that's what makes multiple systems work together for a common cause. If we take a non-healthcare example, which is more prevalent, UPI can be thought of as a standard, correct? Where it's a UPI is a data exchange standard, and it is enabling an ecosystem where different app makers, different app vendors, different banks, right? And multiple peoples of any strata using any kind of phone, whether Android or Apple, are able to exchange or transact in money, right? So that's the data exchange, and that's the standards, right? So standards enable a common shared understanding, okay, which leads to interoperability within the ecosystem. If we take a use case of healthcare, right? Suppose there is a clinic, there is a laboratory, there is a pharmacy, and there is a hospital. So a typical use case, right? So a patient goes to a clinic. In the clinic, the doctor sees the patient, and then there is a need for say investigation to be done. The information would get sent to the laboratory. The laboratory may be in-house or it may be out, right? So, but the information exchange can happen. And similarly, the prescription can go to the pharmacy, right? Seamless. The patient does not have to carry things, right? It can go seamlessly. The information exchange is also between the clinic and the pharmacy. Similarly, if the patient is getting referred from the clinic to the hospital, then again, there is a need for data exchange. Okay. And similarly, from the hospital, again, you will have a laboratory, we have a pharmacy. Now, if you see here, it's a very small use case that I have taken. But in this small use case, you see the need for data exchange, right? So the clinic, the hospital, the pharmacy, the lab, they all need to exchange data, right? In case of lab, you need to send them orders, you have to get back results. In case of clinic to the hospital, you have to send a referral, you have to get back the discharge summary from the hospital. The pharmacy needs to get the prescriptions and dispense the medication, and so on and so forth. Now, all these entities, if they understand a common language, and if they understand, if they have a shared understanding of the data that is being exchanged, right, they will be compatible or interoperable, right? You don't have to make any special effort to make the communication between these guys happen, and they will seamlessly understand each other. And if you see, I have made a FHIR logo at all the entities level, which means that all these entities understand FHIR. So my assumption is these guys understand FHIR. And if you are understanding FHIR, then the seamless exchange happens, while you do not have to worry, right? So now, in this example, if you see, there are a lot of concepts that we need to understand. So first is the technical interoperability, okay? That's the technology layer. So these clinics, hospital, pharmacy, lab need to be connected. Means they need to be connected via the internet, via the wire, so that the data can get exchanged, right? So that's the technology layer. They also need to have a shared format, correct? Saying that they all understand XML, they all understand JSON, they all understand FHIR. So that's the technical interoperability. So that's needed. Then the semantic interoperability. Now, you are able to exchange data. Done, right? So you have connected all the hospitals, the LAN wires are there, they are on internet. But if you are just sending garbage, it does not mean anything, right? So you have to send data which is understandable by the participating entities, right? And that is called as semantic interoperability. And that's the data interoperability layer, which means that it's the data that is being exchanged is being able to understood by the receiving party. So sender is able to send the data in the format and with the meaning that the receiver can receive and understand. Okay. So once you have the data layer in place, then comes the human layer. Okay. Human layer is more about, human or the process layer is more about what do you do with the data, right? So you have to enable the users, right? In this case, maybe the pharmacist or the lab technician or the clinician to be able to use the data, right? If technology is there, data is there, but if people are process and systems are not enabling users to use the data effectively, then also the interoperability is broken. And then the last layer or the highest layer is the institutional or the you can say the institutional layer as well, and you can just say there. So it is the layer which talks about all the incentives, all the culture, all the regulations. Means everything is there. Technology is there, data is there. People are willing to work. People are willing to use the data. But if your institution does not incentivize you to use it, if there are regulations which are barring from data exchange, right? If there is a culture of not sharing data, right? Then again, there will be a problem with interoperability, right? So in order to have a simple interoperability that we saw here to work effectively, all these four layers have to work in unison, okay? Today, in FHIR, we will be talking mostly about the technology and the data layer. Process, clinical, and institutional layer will be out of scope for our current scenes. Okay. Now, we talked about interoperability, we talked about standard, but the question is, what is a standard, right? So a lot of people try to say or try to understand standard as something that is being used across, being used widely. So if something is being used widely, and it is by consensus, then it becomes a standard, right? So in order to make a standard, there will be a recognized body like ISO, ANSI, HL7, okay, who will create a specification, rules, guidelines, right, and pass it by consensus to be used across. If that happens, then a standard forms. And examples of standards are like DICOM, SNOMED, FHIR, CDA, HL7 version 2.3.1, and so on and so forth. So standards, remember, standards are rules, guidelines, specifications, right, for a specific purpose in a given context, right, which are agreed, which are developed by a recognized body, and which are agreed by the wide industry. So, right? So that's what a standard is. So in short, a standard is something which is driven by consensus and recognized or driven, built by a recognized body. Like, for example, in our case of UPI, UPI was, I think, developed by NCPCI, right? And it is a consensus and being used across. Now, benefits of standards. Once you have standards, you have multiplier effects. Just keep in mind for now UPI, because UPI is the most easiest way to understand standards. You can take into account, even think of TCP/IP also as a standard or something else as a standard. But UPI is a good standard to think of when you're talking about multiplier effort, avoid vendor lock-in. These are all self-explanatory, right? Think of UPI, you'll think of multiplier effort. How the UPI revolutionized the payment system, right? There are not one vendors, right? Multiple vendors. Cost has reduced for the user and for the vendors. Risk is mitigated because now there is a lot of choices and there is interoperability. And this is like not an exhaustive list. This is like some top 5 that I have picked up. And this may not be even the top 5, but something that you can understand, like what are the benefits of standard and why you should be using standards. Okay. And the whole point that we were trying to drive is that interoperability is enabled through use of standards. And interoperability is not just a technical thing. There are multiple layers that come into play, right? While the most important layers or the fundamental layers are the technology and the data layer, which we are going to talk this session. All right. So this is important and useful for our use case or anyone who is working in the integration space or anyone who is dealing with multiple systems, right? Anyone who is responsible for maintaining multiple systems, right? They would know and they would attest that point-to-point connections, if system A and system B have to talk to each other, you will have to design an interface between system A and system B. If there are three systems, then you have to maintain three links, right? So on and so forth. So as the number of systems in your organization or across the organization grows, if you are not using standards, right, then you will have to develop proprietary point-to-point connectivity. And suppose you get to 100 nodes or 100 systems that need to be connected together, which is not abnormal. In a typical hospital, in a typical decent size healthcare ecosystem, you will anyways have around 50 to 80 systems that you have to deal with, right? So suddenly your number of connections will just go out of hand if you're not using standards, right? So all point to point, you have to understand everyone's data format, you have to understand everyone's nuances. But if you are using standard, right, you have everyone deals with the same standard, right? And then suddenly your complexity reduces. Okay, that's another benefit of using standards. If you're using standard, you are reducing the complexity to a large extent. Benefits of interoperability for different people. Okay. Now, this is the last slide of interoperability before we get into FHIR. So while we say interoperability is important, interoperability is needed for current ecosystems to work, there are several challenges. And some of the challenges we highlighted already in the institutional layer and in the people layer, process layer, right? Apart from that, there are challenges like the health systems, the current systems, they are disparate, they are in different levels of maturity, and they may not be talking to each other. Semantic interoperability, the interoperability about preserving and communicating the meaning of data, right, is still a challenge. Privacy and security, right? So always the discussion when it comes about interoperability, invariably people discuss about privacy and security, and they say like interoperability may be a hindrance to privacy and security, correct? So which is not the case. But again, privacy and security and interoperability are like their interplay is a little bit difficult to understand. Okay. And then there are like other challenges into the interoperability world. Okay. Now we'll take a pause here. We will take a pause. We will just assimilate what we have understood. The key things to take away is in the current connected ecosystem, there are multiple systems at play and multiple parties at play. These parties, these ecosystem to work effectively have to exchange data with each other. Exchanging data with each other is beneficial for getting the desired outcome, okay? And it is also simplified if you are using standards. Standards are nothing but a consensus-driven artifact, which is published by a standards body, okay? FHIR is one of the standards, correct? Now we are coming to principles of FHIR. So here we'll take a pause, and if there are any questions, we can take 5 minutes to answer those questions, if they're already not answered. Okay. Are there any questions? I don't see. So I don't think there are any questions that I am able to see right now. So if there are no questions.
So then there was a question related to V2X. I'm not sure what is the question exactly.
I'm not seeing the
So
question.
there is a question around what are the main components of the V2X message. So I was explaining, I mean, knowing V2X is not mandatory here. So
Yeah.
hence, like, don't worry. So, but I think some confusion, they are expecting something else.
Yeah, I think that came from the survey, I think, which Arun presented. And in that, a lot of participants told that they don't understand V2X. But understanding of V2X is not required for FHIR. Okay. You are fine without that. Okay. So if there are no further questions, we will jump on to the next segment, that is principles of FHIR. In case you have any questions, right, it will be better to get onto Zulip and answer there, put in there, so that even after the session we can answer them. And I think there is a questions here topic there somewhere. Let's see. There is in general, there is a questions here topic. In that you can ask your questions, and then we will start answering them. Okay. Okay. So a quiz before we get started. Quiz is, what is the full form of FHIR? You can put in the Zulip chat, or you can put in the meeting chat, Zoom meeting chat. Anyone? Okay, yeah. Fast healthcare interoperability resources. Correct, correct, correct. Yeah, I think most of you have got it. Okay. A tricky question. What is fast? So what is fast? So in the fast healthcare interoperability resources, what does FAST stand for? Yeah. Yeah, I think Rajiv has answered fast to implement. Speed of old data, Madhu. Instant, Dinesh. And data exchange, fast to implement. Okay. All right. So we will talk about fast as well. It's not real time. Fast, we'll talk about it. Okay. So now let's go to principles of FHIR. And this quiz was just to get you to the beginning. Okay. Background of FHIR. So we wanted to take a few minutes and talk about the background. Okay. So remember, healthcare data exchange or healthcare systems interoperability is not a today's problem, right? The problem is since when the computers came into being, or when the computers came into healthcare, right? So that time, as soon as you had one or more than one computer, you started to think about how to connect them, how to exchange data, right? And then with that need, there were multiple standards that started coming in, right? HL7 version 2.x, CDA, V3, and so on and so forth. A lot of standards started coming in, right? And also you think like initially the use case was interdepartmental, right? How do we make the systems within the department work together? Then it became inter-organization. How can we make the systems within the organization work together? So for example, within a department, right? So there is a radiology information system and there are like imaging modalities, right? How do we make them work together? That's within the department, right? So you your modality, the X-ray or the CT machine needs to take the order from the RIS and has to give you back the results or the images, right? That's within the department. Now, within the organization, the registration is happening at the front desk. The ordering is happening at the clinician's clinician's room, and then the information has to go to the radiology department, and then the scanning will happen. Now you see, you have an interaction between the front desk and the clinician who is sitting in his own consultation room, and then the radiology department. So it started happening there. Then the next level of evolution happened where your interaction started going out of the walls of the organization, saying that, okay, now you want to give the patient access to the data, for example, right? Or you want to refer patient to a different clinic or a hospital which is outside of your clinic, or you want to send to a different pharmacy, right? Now, suddenly what happened was the use cases started becoming cross-organization and crossing the boundaries of the physical boundaries of the hospital or the healthcare system. Now, these were the challenges and these were the things that the founders of FHIR started looking at. And when they were doing this, they were also dealing with failure that came in between, right? So HL7 version 3, right, was not a massive success, where while it was a very comprehensive standard, it did not meet the success that it desired, right? So there was a need for relook at what the next generation of data exchange would look like, right? So that was the beginning, right? How do we build a healthcare information exchange standard, which is catering to the ever-evolving need of data exchange, not just within the premises, but which is slowly becoming regional, national, and international, right? So how do you have something which is international data exchange, right? So within countries, how can you do exchange? Then how do we make sure that we are still remaining relevant, right? So those were the questions that came up to the founders. And then in 2011, right? So 2011, the HL7 Fresh Look Task Force was constituted, which looked at what would be a health data standard if it was developed from scratch today. Okay, and at that point in time, the web technologies were taking up, the Facebook, Google, and all were coming up, and REST was like ruling the roost. Means everything was RESTful, right? So you had resources, you had HTTP verbs, post, put, get, and so the inspiration for FHIR also came in from the RESTful world, right? And what the founders quote, is the high-rise APIs that they found to be very simple and straightforward, which could form the basis of FHIR. And that's how the genesis of FHIR happened. And the proposal, if you see, earlier it was called as Resources for Health. And there is a blog post by Graham, who is considered the father of FHIR, who has written a proposal, or who has written uh, a proposition of what resources for health would mean. And you can take a look at that in the blog. Okay, that's the genesis of FHIR. So genesis of FHIR is primarily looking at what standards would serve for the ever-evolving need of data exchange, which is not confined to just the organization's boundaries, but becoming national and international. And how do we use something which is a more technology friendly and which is more commonly used, right? Those are the things that people thought of while designing FHIR. Okay. Now, we'll talk about what is FHIR. So everyone understands and everyone knows that FHIR is an acronym and stands for Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources. Now, fast, I think while everyone understands healthcare and interoperability, two things, fast and resources, we need to explain. Fast, okay? If you have a background in healthcare interfacing and integrations, right? From version 2, CD and other standards that were there, right? It used to take few weeks and months to implement those, right? So the fast is a relative term here, which says that FHIR, and again, it's a claim uh, that FHIR wants to live up to, is that in doing integrations with FHIR is relatively faster than what you have done with any other standard. Okay, so that's where the fast comes from. Fast again is not an absolute, it's relative, and it's something an aspirational goal. Resources. Resources are the foundational or the fundamental blocks of FHIR. Again, the inspiration is from the REST world, where resources are their unit of exchange. We'll discuss resources more. Okay. Now, FHIR in a nutshell. So if somebody wanted you to explain FHIR, right? How will you explain? In one, say in 5 minutes. So you say FHIR is an acronym. It's a standard from HL7. The latest version of FHIR is R5. So what means this? Revision 5 or release 5 is the latest version of FHIR. It's free and open. Okay. Prior to FHIR coming on to HL7, and there is a history behind it. So we can discuss the history in some Zulip discussion someday or in some other session, but there is a history. Why free? What was the meaning of free? And what was before free? So remember, FHIR, before it came into HL7's fold, HL7 standards were paid, and only if you are a member and you have paid for it, you could purchase and download and use the standards, right? So FHIR was the first standard from HL7 stable, which was made free and open. So you don't have to pay anything to use FHIR. Okay. Resources are the building blocks of FHIR. Okay. And FHIR supports multiple paradigms of exchange. So what it means is, it does not matter how you exchange the data. Once you have codified data in FHIR resources, you can use any method to send or receive the data, right? So some of the methods which FHIR supports are APIs, means you can do post, put, get, like that. You can use messaging that as you used in the older days of HL7 version 2. You can do document exchange. So suppose you are creating a discharge summary or a prescription record or something like that. Just give me 1 minute, please. Okay. So irrespective of what is your, like, how do you exchange the data? If the data is encoded as FHIR resources, you can send them or use RESTful APIs, messaging, documents, or services, whatever it is, right? So if somebody asks you what is FHIR, and you just have to explain them in, say, 1 or 2 bullets. All you have to understand is FHIR is resources, or FHIR is encoding of clinical concepts in resources, and exchange through RESTful APIs and other means, right? So encoding data, encapsulating data, and sending or exchanging data. If you have those 2 things, you know FHIR. And the specification is here. Okay. Now, fundamental principles of FHIR. Okay. So there are 3 things, that 3 separate uh, blocks that I wanted to consider. The first one is, what are the priorities and scope of FHIR? The second is, what are the principles of FHIR, and what is the technology and dependencies, right? So now FHIR scope and priorities. So fundamentally, FHIR prioritizes implementation. What it means is, if you see the FHIR documentation, FHIR layout, FHIR specification, and the support ecosystem, right? It is towards implementation. It's to make the implementation more and more faster and robust, right? So it's not some boring pages and pages of specification without understanding how to implement, right? So if you're going through a FHIR specification, quickly you can start implementing, right? Flexible framework for interoperability means, irrespective of whether you have RESTful APIs, documents, services, messaging, you can start exchanging data, right? Okay. Now, complexity, the FHIR is an intelligent standard in such that it just keeps the complexity away, right? So for example, it does not design its own messaging format, right? It just used whatever is available. So encoding JSON and REST, JSON and XML is used, right? Technology wise also, it is leveraging the technology that is widely available. So for example, if you are a web developer, if you are a Java developer, if you are a backend developer, right? It would be difficult for you to get your hands dirty with HSM V2, CD and all, because there is a big learning curve. There is a specialized knowledge that you need to have. But if you want to get onto FHIR in one day time, you can start developing applications or developing certain interfaces in FHIR, right? Because you're leveraging the common web technologies, right? We'll see that. Okay, towards the end or tomorrow, we will do some kind of a hands-on where we will start playing with FHIR. Anyone, irrespective of whatever your background is, right? If you invest some time, you should be able to start doing something meaningful with FHIR. FHIR supports backward and forward compatibility, and the tooling required is minimal, so you don't need any specialized tool to work with FHIR. Whatever tooling you have, whatever currently you use, you should be able to use it for FHIR. Okay, and this data is taken from Confluence. Okay, now same principles, put it in different way. Okay, the FHIR manifesto. I'll not read this. You just take it just for a minute. All right. So what does implementer focus mean? Okay, implementer focus means that the target of a specification or a standard should be implementable, right? And implementers are not just programmers. So that is something that we have been clarifying from day one, right? Implementers are not just programmers, but implementers are anyone who is in the process of implementing FHIR, right? So it can be a business analyst, it can be a product manager, it can be a programmer, it can be an interface engineer, anyone, right? How do we make them understand the implementation, right? So specification is written with keeping implementation simplicity in mind, okay? Why this is standard, how did we arrive at it? All the background information is not there in the specification, right? So that means that it's a very clear and concise implementation standard, okay? Now, if you are doing something for implementation, what is the first thing that anyone will ask? Do we have examples? Okay. Do we have reference implementations, right? All those things are there in FHIR, which makes its implementation very, very fast. And that is one of the reasons why FHIR has picked up as compared to other standards, because from day one, the focus has been how it can be implemented quickly. Support for common scenarios. This is another thing that FHIR has taken and FHIR has done differently from other standards, or say, for example, V3 standard, right? Where it says like the base specification does not have to worry about everything about the world, or it does not have to model everything that is there in the healthcare world. If something is widely adopted, widely used, that will find a place in the core specification. Okay. Anything else which is very corner, which is specific to your use case, FHIR will provide a method of adding those by extensions. Okay. What does this mean? This makes your FHIR core resources very, very simple and easy to understand. Okay. Now the question that comes is, if it is only 80%, like say if it does not cover all the nitty-gritties that I want, then it's useless for me. I cannot use it, right? And if I put extensions, if I put my custom things, then interoperability might be broken, but that's not the case. There is a structured way of defining extensions. So extensibility is part of the base definition, right? So that's how the interoperability is guaranteed through extensions as well. Okay. as I told, FHIR focused on what is readily available in terms of technology. So it does not need you to have specialized technologies, right? So, for example, the resources can be shared in XML and JSON, right? You can do the same API calls like you do for Google, Twitter, or anything like that. For security and all, you can use the same standards that you use for your web servers like HTTPS. You can use OAuth 2 and so on and so forth. The benefit is suddenly what happens is anyone can be a FHIR developer, right? And suddenly you have a wide talent pool. So if you want to build something on FHIR, you can just do it quickly. Okay. Now, human readability. This is a core concept that came in from version 3 of HL7, where they said, like, what happens if somebody does not have an access to any of the tools or any of the applications that understand FHIR, right? In that case, what happens, right? So what FHIR has enabled is that if you have a FHIR document or a FHIR resource, and if you have a plain vanilla browser, if you just open that resource in the browser also, you should be able to understand what is the content of the resource. That's the human readability part of it. Okay. And FHIR says that every resource should have a human readable expression, just in case you want to fall back on base minimum interoperability. Okay. And this is attained through adding XHTML narrative section in every resource. We'll take a look at it. Okay. Freely available, we already discussed. It's a Creative Commons zero license, which means a truly public domain license. You can use FHIR as you want to use. The only thing is HL7 FHIR protects HL7 protects the trademark FHIR. So in case you are using FHIR in some novel ways and something which is like you think it's very novel, it's a good idea. It's something that is encouraged that you take a trademark approval from the HL7 before using it. Okay. So suppose in your website or in your application, you're writing something as FHIR enabled or FHIR based something, means something which is like uh, giving a different name to your application, right? It's good idea to check with HL7 whether you can use that name or not. Okay. And how do FHIR makes money? So how standards are developed, and this is something that I think Arun covered on day 0. So standards are based on consensus, right? So in consensus, there are like standards that are coming onto the table and you have to vote for the features, right? When you're voting for the features, this should be there, this should not be there. I think that's where the HL7 says, like, if you are a member, then only you can vote. And membership comes with a price. Okay. Now, paradigms. Paradigms are like, what are the different ways that you can use to exchange or exchange health records or exchange resources, right? So FHIR supports 4 paradigms out of the box. One is REST. REST is the most commonly used. It's simple, what you use for any of your websites or any of your servers, right? So even Zulip, if you see, we have FHIRindia.zulipchat.com / you can do all your channels and all with REST enabled, right? So FHIR uses REST. FHIR uses documents. So documents for long-term persistence. So suppose you are creating a discharge summary or a prescription and you want to create documents, you can use documents paradigm. If you are in a request response kind of a paradigm where you are event driven, and if you want to choose messages, you can use them. And if you want to do complex operations, right, which are not very well supported by simple REST or CRUD operations, right, you can use the traditional SOA methodologies, right? The beauty is, irrespective of the method of exchange, the content remains the same, and the content is coded in the resources, correct? So as long as the resources are the same, it does not matter how you are exchanging the data, because once the data reaches the receiver, they can understand data because it is FHIR. Okay? And that's where it comes to the next important aspect. So while FHIR supports 4 paradigms, Okay, it does not make any assumption on your existing architecture. Okay, or it does not mandate that your system should be designed in such way. No prescriptions. Okay, so there are very common use cases that we have seen. You have an older system. Okay, on top you have a interface engine or a broker that you have put in, and then you have FHIR interfaces. Right, we have seen that. You have seen apps built directly on FHIR. Okay, so where FHIR is the data store and apps are built on that. You have relational databases, you have an interface engine on top, and you have FHIR on top of that. So however you want to implement FHIR, it's your choice. What you implement, the FHIR specification says, right? So there is no right and right. You don't have to always build a happy FHIR server. You don't have to always build a .NET FHIRly server, right? The meaning is that. So you have to closely understand and study what is your current system, what do you want to do, what are the FHIR features you want to enable, and what is the best way to enable, right? There is no right and wrong answer that you have to do only this way, right? So suppose I have traditional EMR or EHR. I will use an interface engine to expose things, correct? If I'm building a data lake or something like that, maybe I'll use a FHIR data repository, correct? And if you have traditional messaging systems and now you want to support FHIR, maybe you can put a broker. These are the three use cases that are listed here, but there can be n number of use cases, right? You can choose whatever you want to choose, okay? Okay. Now, this is the last theory piece before we get into some practicals. So maturity levels. Now, you know that FHIR is an evolving standard, and a lot of work is being done to make the standard mature, right? Now, you know that there are like more than 140 resources in FHIR, like patient, practitioner. These are all resources. We'll discuss what are resources. And there are different subcommittees or work groups that are working on these resources, right? Now, how do you know that these resources are good enough to get into the market or good enough for implementers to implement, right? So FHIR has developed a maturity model where it says that normative is the model, or maturity normative is the level of the resource or a FHIR artifact which is considered as stable. Okay. Rest are like various degree of maturity. So FFM 0 is the draft standard, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 as the maturity goes on, right? So if a standard or if an artifact is at a maturity level 3, 4, 5, they are fairly stable. Okay. Yes, Nishu. Fine. Sit. All right. So what it means also when as an implementer, right? When we are choosing resources, when we are trying to see resources, you have to know the risk that you are taking with the resources. For example, if you are taking a low maturity FHIR resource, right? That means you should bear with you, or you should understand that those resources might undergo changes, and some of those changes could be breaking changes, right? So as an implementer, the maturity model helps you understand the risk and have the mitigation plans accordingly. Okay. Okay. So now we get into the key concepts. So these were the FHIR principles and FHIR manifesto, FHIR main aspects of FHIR. Now we will get into the key concepts of FHIR. We'll take again 2 minutes pause. If there are any questions, we'll take up, or we'll get into the key concepts. So are there any questions, Selva or Arun, that we need?
Most of the questions we are answering over chat.
Oh, good.
But if you want to make, I think we should take up one question. What is difference between FHIR and what is HL7?
What is the difference between FHIR and HL7? Huh? Okay. So FHIR. So first of all, HL7, right? HL7 is a standards development organization. So HL7 is an organization. Okay. That's number one difference. HL7 produces multiple standards. Okay. FHIR is one of the standards from HL7. So is CDA, so is version 3, and so is HL7 V2. Okay. So these are different standards that are produced by HL7 organization. Now, HL7 organization and HL7 V2 are somewhat synonymous. So we see people, when they talk about HL7, they actually mean HL7 version 2. Okay. So just to clarify, version 2 is a standard from HL7 org. Okay. But in the industry, in the market, when people say HL7, they actually mean HL7 version 2. Okay. So that's one. One question was about backward and forward compatibility. Okay. So backward compatibility is when you are designing a system, right? So the future systems, right? So you have a system that are designing today. It still works with the existing systems that are there, okay, or the older systems that are there, right? So that is the backward compatibility. And forward compatibility is when you are designing today, your current systems will still work with future systems. That is the forward compatibility. Now, how they are enabled? They are enabled through various methods. Like, for example, you don't delete anything in the existing standard, but you just add on attributes. You don't make things mandatory. You make them optional. You don't change data types drastically, right? You just make them add-on. So there are different ways and methods through which you can enable backward or forward compatibility. Okay. And with that, we get on to the next section, that is the FHIR key concepts. If you go through this section, I think you are done. You are now an expert on FHIR. Okay. So you are good enough to talk to anyone on FHIR. So let's go through the FHIR key concepts. And I am going a little bit fast. Okay. I'm going a little bit fast, assuming that you would be already doing your homework with the URLs and the FHIR background. So use one of the things that I recommend is always have ChatGPT or Gemini on when you are learning something, right? If any of the concepts or any of the terms that you don't understand, right? Either you ask the presenter or just search on any of these LLMs, right? ChatGPT, Gemini. They do a fantastic job of explaining the concepts that are already understood. Okay. So use them. All right. So the first key concept that we need to understand in FHIR is what are resources. Okay. So without going in what is written on the presentation, I would say resources are the basic building blocks of FHIR. They are the smallest unit of exchange in FHIR. So the smallest unit of exchange in FHIR is resource. So you can only exchange resources, right? You can't exchange, say, data types. For example, address or name and all. They cannot be exchanged independently. Independent exchange happens at the resource level. Okay. And resources are typically, you can think of them as classes in programming concepts, and they actually represent a healthcare entity or a healthcare unit of interest. So, for example, patient is a resource which represents patient's demographics, right? Location is another resource which represents a location's vitals or location's demographics. Similarly, medication is for medication, allergies for allergy, and so on and so forth, right? So you get a point, right? So resources are smallest unit of exchange in FHIR, and they represent something which is of interest in healthcare, right? So now every resource has an URL and identity. So every resource has an ID. It contains structured data items which are defined. we'll see what a resource looks like. Okay. Now, this will clarify what is a resource and what is not a resource. So, for example, patient, practitioner, and organization, these are resources. Location, coverage, invoices, these are resources, right? Bundle, binary, composition, resources. But gender is not a resource because it's too small a data type to be of any interest. Electronic health record. Now you're saying I want to exchange complete electronic health record of a patient, right? I want to build a resource for electronic health record. That's not possible. Okay. What you can do is you can combine multiple resources to build electronic health record. But electronic health record itself is not a resource because it's too big. Blood pressure, for example, is too specific, right? So if you are building a resource for blood pressure, then you have to build a resource for all the observations that are there, right? All the vitals that are there, right? So again, that's not a good example of a resource. If you want to use to represent blood pressure, observation is a good resource that you can use. Okay. Hope that clarifies that. Now, resource example. So typically, if you see any FHIR resource, it will have like these 4 sections. Okay. The first section is about the resource identity and the metadata. It says, what is the ID of the resource? What is the metadata of this resource, right? When was this last updated? What is the security of this resource? What is the language of this resource? All those things are conveyed in the resource metadata. Then comes the human readable summary. This is what we talked about, the base level of interoperability or the human readability, right? This is typically an XHTML narrative section, right? After that, we talked about extensions, right? So as you know, there are 80-20 rules, and not whatever you want may be there in the base FHIR resource. So what you will do is you will use some extensions. The extensions could be defined already, or you want to define your own, right? In any case, the extensions come in next, and then comes the structured data. Okay, so this is a typical resource that you will see, a typical structure of a resource, and we'll see some of the resources in action. Okay. And if you see, these resources can be represented in XML or in JSON. There is like RDF format also, but I think the most common and the most popular are JSON is number 1, and then XML is the number 2. And you can click on this link and go there. Now, jumping a little bit faster. So for example, you have a use case, okay? You want to say, I want to represent a laboratory finding, all right? Or I want to represent allergy, I want to represent a patient's chief complaint, right? And I'm not sure what resource I should be using, or I don't know what to use, right? So FHIR gives you a handy resource guide, okay, where something is already mapped, okay? So it is more to like help you understand and get started with the implementation. So for example, I want to represent laboratory results. You can either use a diagnostic report with observations or just observations, correct? Similarly, if you have to use vital signs, then the guidance is used observations, correct? If you are using chief complaints, for example, capturing cough, pain, fever, fatigue, please use the condition resource, and so on and so forth, right? So here is the resource guide. You can take a look at it. Okay. We'll cover all these things in detail, but I'm just trying to bring it to the implementer friendliness, right? So as an implementer, right, I'm new to FHIR. I have understood what resources are, but I have a specific need. I want to represent my laboratory findings, right? What should I do? Where should I start? Okay, so there is a resource guide. You can directly jump into it, and you can start from there. Okay. Now, what should we do is we should get onto resource documentation and look at the FHIR page now. So I'll just click on this URL, and you can also browse with me. Okay. so that you can understand better. So this is how a FHIR page looks like. So current release is release 5. Okay. Most widely used release today.
So Kim, we are still seeing the presentation.
How do I go to this? Just a minute. Now?
Now it's visible.
Okay. So this is the URL. Okay. The most current release is release 5. Okay. I was talking about what is the release that is most widely used today. So release R4 or R4B is the most widely used release of FHIR today. And it is the release, R4 is the release that is even mandated by certain regulations in different countries, even in India. Even in India, FHIR R4 is mandated to be used for ABDM and NCX exchange. Okay, so that's number one. The second thing, if you want to go to any of the standards, previous standards, you have a ready-made way of going from the URLs. So here I'll go to the R4 because we'll start working on R4. Okay. Where is it? Now, so there are different ways the standard has been organized. My most favorite one is if I want to talk about resources, I just jump onto resources tab. So this is the resources tab. If you click on that, you will see a listing of resources that are available in that particular release. So I'm on R4 release and I'm seeing a lot of resources that are listed here. Okay. Now the resources are listed in different or arranged as different tabs, right? So you have category listing by category. You can have an alphabetical listing. You can have by maturity. You can have by security category, by standard state, and by committee, so on and so forth, right? I think the most common used is either category or by maturity. Okay. Now, let's take the patient resource, okay? Because that's the most fundamental and most simple and most widely used resource, okay? If you see here, there is a number listed here. So for example, in, you want to sleep? Go here. Go ahead. Okay. So if you see the number that is there in front of a resource, it actually represents its maturity level, okay? So search parameter, for example, here has a maturity level of 3. You know the FHIR maturity model that we have talked about, right? And the beauty of the standard is if you want to understand what is maturity model, you can just click on this and you will go back to the maturity model definition and you can learn from here. Okay, we'll come back. Okay. Now, N means normative. Normative means this standard, this particular FHIR artifact or resource is balloted and now said that this is a stable release. So from N, whenever a resource is marked as N, this means that now on, the specification will guarantee a non-breaking backward compatibility. Okay. So your risk of using N is minimal. Now let's go to patient. Okay. So this is a resource page that will be visible. If you see on the top, you will have the patient. Okay, the URL, you can see that. Now, in a resource, the first thing, right? It talks about the basic about what is the resource. And so in one line, if you want to understand what does this resource do, you just have to read this particular line, which is the top of the line. Okay. And then it goes into the details of what is the scope, where to use, what is the relation and all. And then you have the definition of the resource. We'll come to this in a little bit. And this definition is represented in multiple ways. So you have a structured definition. You can be represented in XML, JSON, Turtle, and so on and so forth. Okay. Then Terminology bindings, constant, will come to that. So now coming to the patient resource. When you're navigating, right, a resource, so first thing you look at it here to figure out what this resource is and whether it is of interest to you, right? Number one. The second thing you want to know, okay, give me some examples of a resource. So you go here, there are a lot of examples that are already ready. You can pick any of these examples, right? These examples can be in different formats that you want to use, XML, JSON, or Turtle. So let's take a general person example in JSON. So this is how a JSON patient resource would look like. JSON. And we'll come to know what exactly it is in some time. Okay. Now, निशु आप जाओ ना प्रोजेक्ट में काम कर रहा हूँ. All right. So now we come to the next important section, that is the resource content section. Okay. This is where most of the implementers spend a lot of their time. Okay. And this is about like what is the content of the resource? How do I read about it? Okay. Now, if you see here, and this is the most common or the most widely used representation or layout in which implementers look the FHIR resource. If you have a preference, you can look at UML, XML, or JSON representation. But structure is the one representation which is very crystal clear and makes sense. Okay, so most of the implementers use this, and even it's my favorite. All right. Just give me 1 minute, please. Okay, sit here. Okay, so if you see here, the first column is name. Okay, so this is the name of the attributes that are there in the patient resource. Okay, then is the flags. Okay, so flags are different. Flags are special. You can say markers which have a specified or definite meanings. Okay, again, you want to know what is a flag? You just click on this flags table, and it will take you to what the flags are. Okay. So for example, these are the flags. Where is this? These are the flags. Okay. So everything in a FHIR specification, right, is available for implementers without you have to break your head. Sorry about that. She was sleeping, so she had to go. Okay. And so that is the flags. So flags convey special meaning to that is attached to that particular identifier. Okay. So for example, some of the flags that are here is like, for example, this is summary flag. So what it means is, in case you are using this attribute, this attribute can be part of your human readable narrative section. Okay. Then comes the cardinality. Now, as an implementer, you want to know whether this particular attribute is required for me to use or not, right? If yes, can it repeat or not? Right? Those things, right? So cardinality makes sense there, right? So for example, identifier is an attribute which can be 0 to star, means it can be absent, and if it is present, it can be present for multiple repetitions. Now, question, what is an identifier? Just give me a brief answer in the chat. Because identifier is something very important. Good, good, good. Yes. So identifier is a business identifier, or it's the business ID for that particular resource. So for example, MRN can be an identifier for a patient. Then Aadhaar number or the Aabha number when it comes to India, right? Aabha number can be an identifier, right? Now, identifiers are different than IDs. Okay, ID is another identifier. ID is here. If you go here. So every resource has an ID. Okay, and ID is the internal identification of that particular resource on the server or on the repository, right? So that's not a business identifier. It is just, you can think of it as a primary key in your database, right? So every resource has an ID, right? It may or may not have identifiers, right? But identifier is something that is important for you to make sense, because two systems can store Satyam's demographics information in patient resource, but they can have two different IDs, right? My system can have 1234 as my database ID, and GP system can have 456 as the ID. Now, how do you know these two records are the same, right? And they belong to Satyam. You will rely on the identifier and where Satyam's Abha number is given. Okay, for example, which is a nationwide unique identifier, right? So if you see the same Abha number in JP system and same Abha number in say Selva's system, then you know that these two are representing the same guy, Satyam, correct? So on and so forth. Then type is the data type or attribute type that is there, and then some description about what this attribute is. All right. So this is how you read. And now if you want to go detailed of what exactly it is, the detailed descriptions are, if you click on any one of these, you'll go to the detailed descriptions. So for example, identify. Okay. So you'll get to the detailed description of what exactly it is, what is the cardinality and all, so on and so forth. Let me go back. Okay. Now, if you see some interesting things you are seeing here, you know that there is a box, there is a rectangle, there is a box, so on and so forth. And this, I told you how to find out. You just click on that and you'll go there. Okay. Now, if you see, this is a data type and this is a primitive data type. Okay. What is the difference between a primitive data type and a normal data type? A primitive data type is a data type which is like simple, right? Which in itself is standalone, and it is not derived from any other data type, right? So for example, active is a primitive data type because it just has a Boolean, and active data type is Boolean, and Boolean is true or false. So it's a primitive data type. Similarly, if you see name, right? Name's data type is human name, and it's a complex name because it is derived from multiple different data types, right? So remember, in FHIR, you have primitive data types and you have complex data types. Okay. Next thing that you see, there is an X mark. Okay. This is also a representation which represents that a choice. Okay. As we know, FHIR tries to simplify the implementation, right? So whenever you are looking at a resource, right? And suppose you're in a patient resource, right? And you want to represent patient's death, right? Now you are given a choice. X represents a choice. So either you can say patient deceased Boolean, or you can use the patient disease date time. You cannot use both. Okay. So if you're representing a patient's disease status, right? Either you can use a Boolean, which is like true, false, disease true, disease false, or you can just give the disease date time. Simple. If you're giving the disease date time, you know that patient is already died, right? So that's why the choice. And so on and so forth. Then you have this references. You see references. So references are like when one resource is referring to data in some other resource, right? That's where you use references. So for example, this particular patient belongs to this particular organization. So for example, Satyam patient belongs to, say, Apollo Hospital, right? Then the organization can be Apollo Hospital, and then there can be a link, a reference that you can put in, correct? Similarly, who is the doctor for Satyam, right? You can create a practitioner resource and then put a link to that, right? Reference to that, saying that, okay, Satyam's doctor is this, and so on and so forth, right? So that's how simply you represent data in a FHIR resource. Then certain places you see, like for example, gender, you see that this is what it is given: male, female, unknown, others, right? And then bottom, it is saying as administrative, gender, and required. Okay. So what is this? This is a binding strength. Okay. So for code and codable concept kind of data types, there is binding strength that is given. Okay. Binding strength saying like whether you are allowed to use something else or you are mandated to use some this whatever is given here, right? That's what it is. So when it is required means male, female, other unknown. So for gender, you can only use these values. You cannot use anything else. That is what the required means. Whereas if you see here for marital status, they are saying extensible. Extensible means you can use whatever is there prescribed in marital status value set, or you can extend it further if you want. Okay. That's how it is. Now, if you see one more is there. For language, it says preferred. Okay. Now, preferred means the specification says you prefer the value set that is given in this particular list. So for example, if you are to represent language, right? Where is the language? So this is the preferred list of languages that you should be using. Okay. Again, the specification does not say mandatory. It is just saying preferred. Preferred means this is what the preference is, but you can use whatever, but limited to all languages. Means you cannot go beyond certain things. Then patient ID, resource ID, we talked about. Linking and we do not talk. Then the last thing that is important, so this is all description of the resources and all. That is the last thing that is important is search parameters. So when you are implementing a particular resource, right, you would also want to give a facility, or you want to know like what are the search parameters, right, on which we can search this resource, correct? So again, FHIR specification says, I will give you all the search parameters that you could implement for this particular resource. Okay. And that's what is listed here. Okay. You can choose again, not all the search parameters need to be supported by you. Okay. So you can choose whatever search parameters you want to implement and you can implement. Now, this brings you to a different question. The question is, how would I know what search parameters are supported by my FHIR server or by third-party FHIR server? Because suppose somebody is trying to query by general practitioner and the general practitioner is not supported by that particular FHIR server, then how would you know beforehand? How do you know when you're developing a system? So we'll come to that. Keep that in mind. Okay. Now coming back to our slides again. Can you see the slide?
Yeah, we can see. Meanwhile, Satyam, would you like to take this question? Is ABDM compliant to FHIR? To what extent?
So, okay. So as we know, FHIR supports multiple paradigms. Okay. We use FHIR's document paradigm in ABDM, which means that in ABDM, we are using FHIR documents. Okay. And ABDM mandates use of FHIR document for data exchange.
Another question is, can we use business identifiers as an ID?
Can you repeat the question, please?
Can we use business identifiers as the ID?
Logical ID, you mean, right?
You can use, but the challenge will be in your implement. So if you have a primary key as business identifier, right? So for example, Satyam's MRN number, you have put it as an ID, right? If there are multiple versions of Satyam, right, or something else, right? It all depends on how you are maintaining the ID. So, but there is no rule that you cannot use the ID and the identifier. Okay.
Can
You
I
have to
create
think of,
my own resources?
yes, yes. Can you?
Can I create my own resources?
If you are saying of defining your resources apart from what is defined in FHIR, right? So for example, patient is defined, but you want to define a resource called as my patient, right? For example, that is not allowed. Okay. You have to use resources that are defined in FHIR. You cannot go beyond that. Okay. Now coming back to a special type of resource, that is a bundle resource. Okay, a bundle resource is a special resource, and it is relevant for our discussions is because it's a resource which can contain multiple resources. So suppose, uh, give me, so you are doing a search saying, give me all the patients having name Satyam, or patients name starting with say Kumar, right? So you might get multiple patients, right? Now in the search result, you want to list them all, right? So there you have a bundle resource. In that there can be multiple patient resources that you can return, right? Suppose you are building a document. Now a document, if you see, will have multiple resources. You will have a patient, you have so suppose you are building a discharge summary, right? So you will have a patient resource, you have a condition resource, you have an allergy resource, you have a, say, lab resource, observation resource, you will have so on and so forth. And how do you combine all these resources together, right? So that's where you will use the bundle resource. So bundle resource gives you a facility of combining all the resources together. Okay. Now this is a technical grouping, not a logical grouping. So keep that in mind. And bundle is an important resource for a lot of our use cases. Okay, data types we have already covered. In data types, there is a special coded data types. Okay, coded data types are like simple codes where like there is a value code and the value. Then a coding is code plus the system saying that I am using SNOMED and this is my value. That is the coding data type. And codable concept is multiple codings. If you want to use for one particular attribute, then you use a codable concept. And finally, you have a optional text that you can say, what exactly do you mean by that? So this is important when you're doing the profiling. We'll come to that. FHIR REST paradigm, I think we have talked enough about it, so I'll not talk more. Okay. This is a typical FHIR URL in a REST paradigm. This is a FHIR server. This is the type of the resource, and this is the ID. Now, this ID, the question was, can I use a business identifier? Of course, you can use, right? But remember, the purpose of this ID is this is the permanent resource location on your server, right? So whenever somebody is using this ID, you should fetch that resource and give it back. Okay. Now, this is not relevant for this particular discussion. We'll take it up later. But what it means is there are different levels at which your FHIR servers can support operations, right? So some operations are supported at an instance level, like for example, read, vread, update, create, and all. Some are at the type level, and some are at the system level. Okay, so we'll come to that. Now, search. Search is like what you do for a typical RESTful search. So for example, you want to search for a patient whose name is Smith, right? So this will be the example. Okay, question mark name equals Smith. Okay. Now, if you want to do a complex search, so for example, you want to search an observation for a patient whose name is John, you can do this way. Okay. And search parameters, as we saw, like for every resource, the search parameters are given at the bottom of the resource page. And then there are common search parameters that are listed, which are applicable across all the resources. So for example, underscore ID, that's a search parameter that is applicable across all the resources, right? So that is defined in common search parameters. Okay. You will also come across certain operations when you are using FHIR, right? So they are like something which will be starting with $. Okay. So these are operations which typically cannot be handled by the basic CRUD operations that they're there. And there the server has to do something extra, right? So that's where the FHIR specification defines some operations. Okay. So operations, like for example, one operation that is very, very commonly used is $everything. So for example, given a patient with ID 1234, I want to get all the resources that are related to this particular patient, right? You want to do that kind of an operation, right? So if you do $everything, then you will get a bundle, FHIR bundle with all the resources that are related to this particular patient. Right? So that's something, a special operation, everything operation. You understand my point, right? Similarly, $expand is another operation that has been defined for terminology servers. So on and so forth. So operations are special, you can think of special commands which are defined to do special work. Okay. A document paradigm, we will discuss when we are discussing ABDM in detail. But a document paradigm is something where you want to build a singular context, right? For example, you want to build a discharge summary for a patient, right? You want to be able to sign that particular thing, authenticate that particular thing, and make sure that that particular document instance is valid, right? Then you can go with a document kind of an artifact, right? The how to identify whether a bundle is a document or not. So first of all, the document type will be so the bundle type will be document. That's the type of it. And second, the first resource in that document will be a composition resource. When we look at documents, we'll look at it in detail. Okay. Messaging and services, we don't use much, so I'll not put a lot of efforts here. Okay. Now comes to important things. So what you understood so far and what we discussed so far is this question. And please answer in yes, true or false. Just answer this. No, false, true, yes, true, 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 false, true, maybe. Okay, I think enough. So the answer to this is does not guarantee, right? Two systems may comply with FHIR, but they may not be fully interoperable. Okay, why? Because if you see the FHIR specification is very flexible. You saw that. You have choices of what search parameters you want to implement, what you don't want to implement. You have a choice of paradigm you want to implement, what you don't want to implement. You have like flexibility in terms of cardinalities, correct? Saying that something is optional, something is required, right? Then terminologies, you saw there is a flexibility. Some are preferred, some are examples, some are extensible, right? So even if two systems are implementing FHIR, you would need to know a lot more uh, to truly say whether these two systems are interoperable or not. And why? Because of this. So there are more than 140 plus resources. Not all systems will implement all the resources because for me, I don't care. I'm just building a patient appointment management system. I don't care about all the 140 resources. For me, appointment, patient and practitioner and location resource is good enough. Maybe I'll use some kind of a slot and schedule resource. I think I'm done with it, right? Most resource elements are optional, right? Data type, so everything is optional. You can choose what you want to build, and you can choose what operations you want to support, what operations you don't want to support, right? So this context makes it very difficult to gauge whether two systems who claim to be FHIR, to claim that they have implemented FHIR are actually interoperable or not. So what should you do? You need to have a conformance, right? So there has to be a way to declare conformance, right? In that, what you need to declare? What are your resources? What are the elements you are using? What API features are you using? What terminologies are you using, right? And so on. What is required? What is optional? All those things, right? So there has to be a way where your FHIR server should be able to tell these things, right? Then the receiver or the other guys can take a look at it and figure out what is supported, what is not supported. And then that can be the basis of conformance. Okay. One of the tools for making conformance is profiling. Okay. Profiling is constraining or extending the base FHIR resources in a way such that it is very, very specific or relevant to your particular use case, right? So for example, in India, what we have done is we have profiled FHIR resources for Indian specific use cases, correct? We'll take a look when we are look at FHIR profiles for India. And after that, every FHIR server publishes a capability statement. In that capability statement, they talk about, they tell which FHIR version they are supporting, what resources they are supporting, what search parameters they are supporting, and so on and so forth. So if you can compare two capability statements of two servers, you will know whether they are capable or not, whether they are interoperable or not. So that's where it is very important to publish capability statement. Okay. And this is what capability statement says, that they are FHIR conformant and to what extent. Okay. So with that, I will take a break. Now we can go on discussions. There are some references and reading materials that I had put on. So again, as we discussed earlier, right, the intent of these sessions are to have more interactions, more discussions, right? So there are enough and more resources available on website, on YouTube, on different presentation channels, right, where you can take a look at it. Even ChatGPT and Gemini can help you with all. If you have any specific questions, we should be able to take it and discuss it further, right? And that's the intent. So with that, we will get on to Zulip. And if you have any questions, we can start answering them.
So Tim, can you put these URLs as part of the chat?
I'll do. Okay, now we are on Zulip. Can you see my Zulip? Is
Yes.
Zulip visible?
Yes, it's visible.
Okay, let's get on with the questions here. If you have any questions. We had a questions thread somewhere, right? Questions. Okay, so we will start with what type of projects can we can start with technical interoperability. That's the first question that is there with Deepak Marwa. Technical interoperability is the base level interoperability. So if you want to start any integration or interoperability project, right, it starts with technical interoperability, right? So if you want to connect two systems, whether the LAN is available or not, whether internet is available or not, whether they support FHIR or HL7 or not, that all comes under technical interoperability. How are we facing challenges in semantic interoperability? Can we state an example? Okay, so we are facing challenges in semantic. So what is semantic interoperability? Semantic interoperability is when the sender is able to convey the context and the meaning of their data in exact same way as they intend to the receiver, right? Now, if the sender and receiver do not agree to that or have challenges in understanding the same, there will be problems. So for example, if the sender is using SNOMED code, okay, and the receiver is using a line code for lab reports or lab results, right? Then there is a challenge in semantic interoperability because the two guys are talking different language. They are using FHIR. They are using the same attribute that is required. And FHIR says that you can use SNOMED or LOINC. So both are correct. Both are using something what the standard is saying, right? But still they are semantically not interoperable because they are using two different code systems. Okay. So that is one of the challenges. The second thing is like a lot of people are using free text. That's another challenge. Okay. What about data interoperability between hospital and insurance company? Data interoperability between hospitals and insurance, it's not any difference than data interoperability between a clinic and a hospital or a clinic or a pharmacy, right? So in insurance companies also need your clinical records. They need claim adjudication to be done and they need insurance information, right? In fact, in India, we have the Health Claims Exchange. That is a FHIR-enabled claims exchange platform that is now part of the National Health Claims Exchange program, right? Which is trying to enable that for Ashok Kumar. Can we get the presentation? Yes, but the presentation is just an assembly of information, but we'll definitely share this presentation. Can FHIR support images such as X-rays for interoperability? Yes, FHIR can support. So if you go to resources, there is, I think, one resource for images. Imaging study is the resource name, and the binary is the resource. Manish, can we make more discussion on extensions and value sets? How? Definitely. When we talk about profiling in detail, we will definitely talk about extensions and value sets, Manish. Jinju, we have an EMR application and a mobile application for appointment booking. Data exchange as JSON format in our own structure between two applications. Can we replace with FHIR format? Definitely, we can. You can replace it with FHIR format. So whenever you are choosing an interoperability paradigm. So remember, in a limited scope, you will always find standards to be a little bit more expensive to implement. Okay. Now, if it is just a mobile application between an EMR and so your own platform, right? If you have already started with FHIR, continue with it. If you have continued with a particular format, right, which is a proprietary format, right, unless and until there is a significant need that you see of upgradation, you can take a call there, right? So definitely FHIR exchange is useful, but it is more useful when you are talking to different systems than within yourself. Anand, are there any FHIR compliant apps or HIS, HMIS in India besides CDAC and government programs? If yes, then why aren't they advertising or mentioning? They are advertising and mentioning. So if you go to abdm.gov.in and look at the partners page there, all the certified partners are supposed to be FHIR compliant. Okay. Why they are not advertising? That's a different question, but there are FHIR compliant systems. Chandrakant, how non-tech hospital personnel get involved in technological side of FHIR? Chandrakant, to start with, the first thing that any developer or any technical guy would need is the mapping, understanding of the real world use case to FHIR resources, right? That's where experienced domain guy comes into play, where they can tag team with the developers to help them identify and build on FHIR resources. That's number one. The second thing is you can definitely build the rationale for profiles and IGs, right? So those are the things that you can do. Gagan Mehrotra, how two FHIR supported systems will connect to each other outside the organization. If both are if both have the endpoints exposed, right, and they are accessible on HTTPS or say internet, and they have the common agreement on the security paradigms, they should be able to connect, right? Because the only thing that will be limiting is your security policies or the firewalls, right? If you can enable those, then pretty much the systems can connect. Ravi Teja, in FHIR, does all the attributes of a resource required? We just did answer that, right? None of the attributes in FHIR specification are required. And that's where we require profiling, right? So if you see a patient resource, I don't think any of the attributes are required. So it means that if you have a blank blank patient JSON, that is also a valid FHIR resource, right? But is it useful? No. To make it useful, you have to do profiling. To make certain things are required. Ajay Malviya, can I set up FHIR server for my org? If yes, then how can I set up and what should I consider to set up? The first question, Ajay, you have to start with is why do you want a FHIR server? Once you answered that question, then there are a lot of open source FHIR servers that you can start using or start considering. The main thing that you have to consider is what is the purpose of a FHIR server, what kind of data you are going to expose, what kind of operations you are going to support, and what kind of workflows that you are going to support, right? Once you have these 3 or 4 things understood or clarified, what you said, identified, technical aspect of it will be simple. Means you can choose FHIR server of your choice, implementation of your choice, and just go ahead with it. Ashok Kumar, as a public health expert, as health program manager, how can FHIR knowledge can be used for an individual? Huh. Health program manager as a public health expert, I think because more and more regulations are coming and they're mandating FHIR, the FHIR knowledge is useful from a functional side. The second thing is, if you have the FHIR understanding, if you have understanding of what resources do, how they interact, you can actually help devising workflows or systems which can help in your, say, for example, public health surveillance. For example, we did develop a cancer registry, right? So where the it's for a disease surveillance, right? So there, like the use case came from the public health experts, and they told about so ICMR and all gave us the requirements, and then we used FHIR to develop that. Could you explain coding, codable systems with an example? Yes. Code, for example, gender equals male is a code. Coding. Uh, Loing, coding has 2 things, system and code. So system would be Loing, loing.org or whatever it is. And the value is 1-2, 3, 4, 5. That represents a particular Loing code. Okay. Codable concept is nothing but multiple codings together. So you can represent a concept in Loing, you can represent a concept in SNOMED, for example. Then in a codable concept, you can represent both. And then finally, you can put a text also. So when we are doing this profiling example, we will take this in detail, or we can take examples of codable concept as well. And I think tomorrow's practical can also focus on this. Is FHIR supporting scalability for enterprise system? It depends on what you mean by scalability, but definitely FHIR opens up your system. Vijay, assume there is a tech company who has their own platform, which is a different user, and the company has a backend store and share information in any format. How do we compare this with FHIR? Is FHIR usage required? Yes. So if you have a tech platform, okay, and it is being used by multiple, so users are not that important. The important is like what are the apps that you're building on the platform. Whether whether you want to standardize the API exchange, whether you want to standardize the data representation, and what if you allow some third parties also to build on top of your platform. In those scenarios, depending on how you want to use your platform, you can choose FHIR as API standard, or you can choose FHIR as the data representation standard. So for example, one thing that might come is like, what are the attributes of patient that I should store? You want to have that answer, right? A quick, easy reckoner will be just look at the FHIR patient resource, and you'll figure out what are the attributes that you want to store in your platform or model in your platform. Now, whether you want to store in JSON format or in database directly, and all, it's your call, right? But where you can use FHIR is you can look at the FHIR resources and know the clinical models of it. See, a FHIR resource does 2 important things. The first thing is it gives you a clinical or a domain representation of your particular entity. And the second thing is it also tells you on the infrastructure side, on the technical side, what all things you can do with that particular resource. What is the search you can do? What is the terminologies that you can put in? What is the constraints that you can put in, right? So that's what a resource does to you. So you can think of it how you want to represent, but definitely using FHIR will help you minimizing a lot of the decisions that you have to take otherwise. Is there an open source package to convert FHIR bundle into UI? I am not aware, Maheshwar. Should be straightforward. No, it won't be straightforward. I'm not aware. Purushottam, what is the FHIR server? What is the FHIR? What is FHIR server and what will it contain? What will the client do with the FHIR server? Okay. A FHIR server. A FHIR server is nothing but it serves the resources. So it's a store for all your resources where all your data resides, and it is able to serve you those resources via APIs. That's a FHIR server. Okay, so it will have the data and the operations. Client will make calls to this particular server to fetch the data and do some operations like create a patient, update a patient, search for a patient. These are all the clients will do. The server will actually have the data and will serve you. How does FHIR support testing such as conformance and validation? Any tools? There are a lot of tools that are provided. The FHIR validator is one of the tools that is recommended by HL7. Then there are other commercial tooling also available, which you can use. Even FHIR servers do support conformance and validation. What about Tashin? What about patient sequencing data? Do they come under lab report resource and are compliant with? See, patient sequencing data, if you're talking about genomics, I think there is a genomics work group and there is an accelerator on FHIR. You have to look at that. I'm not very sure how to represent that. Harman, what is the security mechanism does FHIR provide to protect patients' data if FHIR server is not hosted by us? Good question. It's the same thing as any web server that you have, or any web server that you have. So FHIR relies on the existing infrastructure or existing mechanisms that are present in the industry for security and privacy. So, for example, whether your FHIR server uses HTTPS or not is the first thing you'll see. What is the authentication and authorization mechanism that your FHIR server does? It use OAuth 2, correct? What is the encryption at rest, data encryption at rest? You can figure that out, right? How does the access, granular access provided? Does it support smart? Does it support attribute-based access controls? Those are the questions that you have to ask the FHIR server. And if they have a specification, you can take a look at their documentation to figure out what all things they support. Certain things may be critical to you, but may not be critical to the FHIR server that they are supporting. So in that case, you have to make a decision like whatever is critical to you is supported by that particular FHIR server or not. And then if there is a flag, it would be written beside the resource name, right? Like NTU. No, that is so at the resource level, if you're saying that is the maturity level that you're saying. At the attribute level, when you're looking at the resource, opening the resource, then the flags represent special meaning to that particular attribute. So one exercise, please. And this is an exercise that you can do midweek and maybe something that we can take up next weekend is go through a FHIR patient resource or a FHIR resource of your choice, right? Go through its documents, just one resource. Try to understand it. And if you have any specific question on that particular resource that you don't understand, right? Please put that in the discussion forum. Let's discuss that, right? Take a resource of your choice. Just go through documentation of only that particular resource. And let's do that, okay? That will simplify something, simplify a lot of things. Okay, I think we are at 12:59 and hope this session was useful to you. What we'll do is from next session onwards, I think we will have more time dedicated to Q&As, question and answer, and we'll try to have more practical discussions around question and answers and less of a theory as we go forward. Means when we do profiling and other tooling, I think more and more we will have more interactions, more discussions, and less of theory. Before we go out, tomorrow, again at 11 o'clock, we will have a session. And this session will be on, it will be more practical focused session. And I think it will be on resources and some interaction with the FHIR server. Okay. So the session will be conducted by Arun, and I will be there to support. Okay. So the session it will be a hands-on practical session on resources and FHIR server. How do you interact with the FHIR server? How do you build resources and do certain things, correct? So that will be a session that will be tomorrow. Arun, if you want to add anything.
Yes. So for tomorrow's session, it is going to be a bit technical, but it is something that all of you can do. On the chat is the suggested software that you should come with for the session. So the first one is Visual Studio Code. This is a freeware where you can write a lot. We are going to use JSONs, and you will be creating the FHIR JSONs in Visual Studio Code. And in order to post the resources to a FHIR server, we will need a client called as Postman. So these are the two solutions that you need to have. Please ensure you have installed and come with it. That's it.
And tomorrow it will be a 1 hour session or 2 hours?
I would suggest keep in between 90-minute sessions. I would showcase for 30 minutes and then 60 minutes for you to try it on. And I will try to answer any questions in between.
Okay. So that's all. We will be sharing the coordinates of tomorrow's meeting on the Zulip chat. Okay. So please make sure that you are monitoring the Zulip chat. And we will also try to send communication using the Google Groups. You would have received a Google Group invite. In case you have not accepted the invite, please do accept, because we are facing challenge in communicating to everyone. The number of registrants is more than what the limit of Google Calendar or a Google Mail supports. So that's why we are relying on Zulip and on Google Groups, and to some extent on WhatsApp broadcasts, to make sure that we are communicating as much as possible. Our request is like, please be on top of this, and if you have not accepted the request, please do accept the request so that you don't miss out on any of the communications. With that, thank you. Have a good day. We'll see you tomorrow at 11 o'clock.